Now, I also want to show real quick the portrayal not just of the original apostles, but specifically Peter. If you remember, here is the parable of the sower, and I think this parable of the sower is talking about Peter. It says, when a sower went out to sow, as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they were withered away. Hear then the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path. For what was sown on rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet such a person has no root, but endures only for a while, and when trouble or persecution arises on account of the word, that person immediately falls away. The reason why I think, and you got this up on the screen, hopefully for those who are getting this in the podcast will understand this. But when you see this up on the screen, I have these words highlighted. Rocky ground. Seeds fell on rocky ground. Peter's name means rock or rocky, Kephas. Also, these seeds spring up quickly, but they wither away, meaning they're very enthusiastic and they're very, they've got a lot of spunk and a lot of energy, and they spring up just like Peter did on many occasions. But the minute that there's a little bit of pushback, little bit of turmoil or persecution, they fall. They wither away. This happens with Peter when he tries to walk on water. A little bit of waves came, he doubted, fell in. There's some other places where he does the same thing. He says that Jesus is the Messiah, and then right after that he rebukes Jesus and says that, tries to teach Jesus. So this is happening all the time. And then Jesus says that the evil one snatches those types of people away. Okay, this is important because as we go through, Peter's name means rock, as we said, but also this parable uses the word scandalizo, which is immediately falls away, to scandal. This is the same verb used later when Jesus tells the disciples that they would become deserters. He says, you guys will become deserters. And this actually happened in the Garden of Gethsemane when everyone flees. Notice that it's Peter that stands up and said, even though all become deserters, I will not. He says this in Mark 14 and Matthew 26, but yet he does leave Jesus. And not only to leave Jesus, he then later denies Jesus. The noun form of the word scandalon is a stumbling block, which is precisely what Jesus calls Peter later in the Gospel of Matthew. He says, but he turned and said to Peter, you are a stumbling block, a scandalon to me. Just as in the parable of the sower, Peter quickly turns from a person of faith to a person with no faith or understanding. He rebukes Jesus and tries to correct him, and then notice what Jesus calls Peter. He calls him Satan. Get behind me, Satan. And he also calls him a scandalon, a stumbling block. Okay, these are fighting words that Matthew and Mark are using to describe Peter. So here, Jesus is consigning Peter to hell when he says, get behind me, Satan. So how do we know this? Because every other occurrence of the word scandalon in the Gospel of Matthew refers to those who will be in hell. So see Matthew 13, 41, 42, and Matthew 18, 7 through 9. 2 chapters later, after he calls him Satan, Jesus says, woe to the world because of stumbling blocks, scandalon. Referring back to Peter in Matthew 16, Jesus continues, quote, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. We also get in Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John, Jesus tells them to stay awake, but they fall asleep 3 times. And Jesus is grieved and says specifically to Peter, quote, so could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Peter also denies Jesus with an oath in Matthew 26. But notice that earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus prohibited his disciples from oath-taking, lest they, quote, never enter the kingdom of heaven. And so while Peter is outside denying Jesus by an oath, Jesus is inside refusing to take an oath at the request of the high priest. This is deliberate language by Matthew. Matthew explains that Peter went out and wept bitterly. This is interesting because each of the 6 occurrences of weeping earlier in the Gospel of Matthew, it refers to the weeping of the damned after the final judgment. Matthew 8, Matthew 13, I'll put them up on the screen here, these verses. And 3 of these 6 occurrences associate weeping with being cast outside into the darkness. So this setting is really showing that Peter is in big trouble in terms of his salvation, according to the author of Matthew. So can we see now how the 2 major factors the Jewish-Roman relations and intra-Jewish relations, how these two major factors influenced the Gospel's portrayal not only of Gentiles and Pharisees, but also of the original apostles. First, the authors of Mark and Matthew were partial to the Gentile inclusive faction of the church. Second, a hostile rivalry had developed within the church between Gentile inclusive faction led by Paul and the Jewish exclusive faction led by Peter. Third, the original apostles, particularly Peter, James, and John, were thought to have been Pharisaic-type Jews who were antagonists to the early Gentile mission. So given these three phenomena, it seems clear why the authors of Mark and Matthew would have disdain for the original apostles and why they would portray them so negatively.